This is a very special day for us at the East Asian Weatherhead East Asian Institute for a couple of reasons. Most important one is that Sheila Smith is back with us. Sheila was an undergraduate here. She got her master's here. She got her PhD here, and so she's a true Olympian, and she's had a wonderful career, which I'll just say a word about in a minute. The other reason this is a special day is we've recently set up a new program at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute called the Japan Research Program, which I'm directing. And the timing is that big changes are occurring in Japan, especially on the foreign policy side and the security side. And that's what Sheila is going to talk a lot about today. This is probably the biggest turning point in Japanese foreign policy thinking since the early years following World War II, with a new national security strategy, a national defense strategy. But even on the economic side as well, you know, Japan was for so long a protectionist. Now it is the champion in the Asia Pacific for free and open trade, so-called free and open Asia Pacific. So I thought that we needed to ramp up the work we do on Japan. For years I've had a small research program here called the Toyota Research Program. The name is kind of self-explanatory. Toyota Motors has been supporting us for decades. And they are supporting this new program now, which is kind of an expansion of the Toyota Research Program, but we're also expanding our sources of support for it. And you'll see over the coming months that we'll be doing a number of new and I hope innovative and useful activities, research-wise, event-wise. I wanted somebody to come to get this program off the ground, to launch us, who could talk with great authority and experience about Japanese national security policy, about U.S. Japan relations, about Japan in the Indo-Pacific, and I couldn't think of anybody else who would be as good on that topic, on those topics actually, as the lady who is sitting in front of you here, Sheila Smith. Sheila is at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, the John E. Merow, I couldn't remember the name. John E. Merow, is that the name? Merow. Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies. And what she is she's been in charge of Japan-related things there for going on to 15 years now. And over that course of time, she has established herself as the go-to person when you want to talk about and understand, get good analysis of what is going on in Japanese foreign policy, national security thinking, Japan's relations with the region, and especially relations between the U.S. and Japan. So I'm really delighted that she agreed to come up from D.C. this afternoon to talk to us. She's written many books, and she's a regular blogger on the CFR blog site, and she's quoted a lot in the media. PBS seems to have a particular fondness for you. Whenever anything comes out about Japan, the first person they get on the TV to talk about it is Sheila. She's really just been a wonderful and astute observer of Japan and U.S. Japan relations. Anything else I should say? Well, she's the chair of the Japan, you know, besides the think tank work she does, the writing, the speaking, and so on. She's also the chair of the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission. She's on the American side of COLCON, the binational U.S.-Japan public-private organization called the U.S. Japan Conference on Cultural and Educational Exchange. And she's constantly on the road to Japan, around the United States. She's a lot of energy, and I'm glad her energy brought her up here today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Sheila to come up to the podium and talk for a while. Then she and I will have kind of a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And after it's all over, we'll be out in the lobby area there. So anybody who'd like to come up and say hello to her, or even say hello to me, you're more than welcome to do so. And so without further ado, Sheila, let me ask you to come on up, and welcome.
I arrived on campus about an hour ago, and all these memories came flooding back of being an undergraduate and a graduate student here, and all of us who came here to study Japanese politics came to study with Gerald Curtis, because he was the preeminent and still is the preeminent scholar of Japanese politics, and none of us would be here without him. And so when he called me up and he said, I have a new initiative, and it's the Japan Research Program, and I want us to do research, serious, substantive research on Japanese strategy and foreign policy, I couldn't get on the plane fast enough. So thank you. It is the time, I think, for us to take seriously the changes that are happening, obviously, around the globe. We've all been, I think, amazed at the kinds of changes, not for the good, that we see in the world around us. But I couldn't say that any part of the world deserves our substantive understanding and knowledge more than the Indo-Pacific. And I, of course, have a sweet spot for understanding Japan. But I think many of us feel that we understand our allies intuitively. We get it. We've got decades, generations of people in Washington, D.C. who have built up networks of relationships and institutional communication with our ally in Tokyo. But that doesn't mean that we actually understand what is happening in Japan. We don't understand the complex mix of dynamics. So part of what I'd like to do today is share with you my sense of what is happening in the security sphere, and then extend it out into the diplomatic effort that Japan is undertaking to ensure its security. You're probably all here because you've been reading the newspaper. You've seen the headlines about the documents that were released last December by the Kishida cabinet, the doubling down or the doubling of Japanese spending on its military and security, as well as the acquisition of counterstrike capability, the first time in the post-war period. What I would like to do is for us today to take a little step back and put that a little bit in context. Those are great headlines for the media, and believe me, they like to use them. But there's a lot more going on that I think we need to be aware of to understand just how people in Tokyo, not just the security experts or the foreign policy makers, some of whom are here with us today, see the world out there, but how the Japanese people also are beginning to see the world that confronts them. So let me start. Susie has generously agreed to work the machine, partly because I can't see it too well from this position, but also it's an important support for me to concentrate on. I wrote a PhD dissertation many moons ago. I'm probably too old to tell you what year exactly, but in the 1980s, about how Japan thought about and planned for its post-war military. Now, all of you I know are understanding that Japan has a constitution, Article 9 of which suggests that Japan won't use its military power to settle international disputes. What is harder to get beyond is what that actually means when you're sitting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Defense, or you're a politician trying to make policy in Japan. So, the puzzle in the 1980s was, why is this rich, tremendous country not spending money on its military? That's what states do. For those of you who are IR theorists, you know this, right? Hard power is what you acquire when you're a big, powerful country. And Japan was the second largest economic superpower in the world, and yet it did not go down that path. So lots of writing in the 1980s about why not. Lots of new terms came into use in IR theory. Civilian power, merchant power was a word that Japanese scholars used. There was other language that was coming out of Washington at the time, of course. Our Congress and other policymakers saw Japan as a free rider, right? Japan was rich. Why wasn't it spending more on defense? And so you had a lot of that kind of political language that focused on the burden sharing aspects. And Japan ought to spend more on its military to share the burden. These are all normative, these are political frames for Japan. They didn't necessarily help me as a grad student when I went out to figure out what was happening, because the minute I got there, I had to decode a lot of language that the Japanese themselves used to try to talk about how their military was different than a normal military, how their military was not, I see Carol smiling, but it was not the military of the pre-war period. This was something different. And so being in tune with that Article 9 meant actually creating a whole new language inside Japan with which to talk about the purpose of Japan's self-defense force. You can hear it in the name. It was not a normal military, it was a self-defense force. It was restricted not only in what kind of weapons it could get, but also the purpose of that military. It was exclusively self-defense oriented. Again, I'm translating from language from Japan. So there's a lot of ways in which I was sort of grappling as a grad student to how to explain this. And an anecdotal, I had a journal ask me to write an article about the research I was doing on the self-defense forces and how it fit into the U.S. Japan Alliance. Now remember, this is the 1980s. And so I translated military, destroyers. I talked the language that our Pentagon people talked, and I submitted it to the journal. This is the Journal of International Affairs at JAIA. Many of you know that's a think tank in Tokyo. And there was a very painful conversation that I then had with the director, who said, "We can't publish this." And I said, "Why not? It's very clear. Is it not right? Is it not correct? Did I make mistakes?" And he said, "No. In English, you're just using a language that we can't use to talk about our defense policy, our cooperation with the United States, and of course our self-defense forces." So that translation exercise, and those of you who are studying Japanese, you'll know this, right? Half of our research is really dedicated to the way in which the Japanese think about themselves, the way in which meaning is imbued in the language that the Japanese use for their policy debates. We are now in a very different era. We're not in the 1980s anymore, as we all know. So we need to catch up. If we could go to the next slide, Susie. So this is my effort to catch up. This is the book that I wrote published in 2019. And I'm not here to advertise it to say you have to go buy the book, but what I want to do is help you understand why I wrote the book. Partly it was my dissertation, but many years later. It was what had happened to Japan's debate about itself and its military after the Cold War ended. Because after the Cold War ended, there were pressures and demands on Japanese policymakers, some of which were external, some of which came from Washington, D.C. After the Cold War was over, we wanted our allies to participate in military coalitions. We wanted the Japanese to go to the Gulf, right? We wanted, and then years later, we wanted the Japanese to do other things, go to the Gulf of Aden in anti-piracy task force with us, go to respond after 9/11 to help refuel the coalition that the United States had put together in response to the terrorism against the United States. So there was a demand signal coming from outside of Japan as much as there were changes that were going on within. So this book really, basically I take a tour of what has changed and why. The part that for me was most fun to write about was the part that's a little nerdy, if you'll forgive me for using that word in a university setting. But it was what are the Japanese military trying to do? What missions are they taking on? What was their threat assessment and how was that changing? And part of the big story that you'll see reflected, and I'll talk about this in a second, in the more recent changes is Japan's own defenses were not keeping pace with the speed of change in the environment that it found itself in. We talk about Northeast Asia as a dangerous environment, but for Japan, the military balance was shifting inexorably in a direction that was not in its favor. So we're looking here, obviously in the mid-1990s, you're looking at North Korea, its acquisition or its ambition to acquire nuclear capability, but really what turned out to be its massive missile development program that today puts most of the Japanese people under threat from Pyongyang. And of course, there were other kinds of technological changes that were going on. and I don't want to overdo the defense techie business, but cyber, right, space. New technologies were proving to be difficult for the Japanese to keep up with, but they were difficult for all of us to keep up with. This was not just Japan's problem. This was a problem that all of our militaries were sharing, and in particular, out in Asia, this was these new domains, as they are referred to in the Pentagon. These new domains were significant in their challenge. Finally, third, the Japanese were also much more open. And I say this not just about Prime Minister Abe, who was Prime Minister for some time, but many Japanese were much, much more open about talking about their constitution, talking about the restrictions and restraints that were implied by not only Article 9, but by other dimensions of the Constitution. Younger Japanese were much more willing to open up the question about, well, why shouldn't Japan invest more in its military power? Why should we restrain ourselves if our neighbors are not restraining themselves, right? Now, that didn't automatically translate into policy change, but it was a fairly open, permissive environment for investigation into some of the things that for most of the post-war period had been taboo to raise, particularly in classrooms and universities, but also in policy circles as well. The final piece that I write about in this book is the importance of the U.S. Japan Alliance to Japan's long-term security planning. We often, when we think about defense or security planning, we often think solely about national power or the framing of national military capabilities. For Japan's post-war era, Japan's defenses are not possible without the alliance with the United States. Now, we all know this. The United States is a nuclear power. Japan is not. The United States maintains forward deploy forces in the region, forces that Japan would not replicate if the Americans went home. And so there is also this question of how Japan is looking to the United States to think about its strategy, not only for itself, for ourselves, but also how we're thinking about the balance of power in the region. So extended nuclear deterrence, for those of you who are security interested students and or IR specialists, extended nuclear deterrence is of course the conversation that Tokyo wanted to have with Washington in more detail and more specificity by the time we came to the 2010s. So in Japan Rearmed, I'm basically trying to help, basically this book was continuation of my dissertation research, but it was also designed to help our policy community in Washington understand the context of Japanese decision making. It wasn't just Prime Minister Abe making decisions. It wasn't just the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Defense. There was a complex context, as there is in every democracy, within which Japan had to think about its security and plan about it. The language that I use in the conclusion is that the Japanese people today, as much as they're expert leaders, have a much different understanding of the utility of military power as part of a comprehensive approach to statecraft. Most of the post-war period, Japan very expertly used its diplomatic and economic levers of statecraft. Now you're beginning to see the introduction of the self-defense force as another lever of Japanese overall strategy. All right, so one last slide, one next slide, please. The United States-Japan Alliance, I think today, and we will get into this when Jerry and I chat, but we are more convergent strategically between Tokyo and Washington than I think I have ever seen us being. Doesn't mean we see every issue from the same perspective. We obviously don't. But there is very little tension in the strategic conversation today between the United States and Japan. There is much more willingness on the part of Japanese policymakers, politicians, and the public to investing more in Japanese capabilities. Not at the behest of the United States, but because many in Japan think that that's required, not only for Japan's national defenses, but also to make sure the alliance is sustainable over the long run. I think the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, as many of you know, he was Prime Minister for 8 years. His leadership obviously created the opportunity for a lot of conversations about different aspects of security policy reform. Everybody here has taken, hopefully, if you're a student, you've taken Professor Dan Smith's class, so you all know about Prime Minister Abe as a politician. So I won't talk about that because that's usually what we talk about. But what I think what is interesting, and especially now that Prime Minister Abe is gone, is that his legacy in Japanese foreign policy is going to be equivalent, I think, of Yoshida Shigeru's impact on the way in which Japanese think about their interests in the world and the way in which they think about how to navigate this complex world that we see. He wasn't always right, so please don't make me, don't misunderstand me, but he was somebody who understood that Japan would have to have a voice on the world stage, would have to navigate these interests of its own much more forcefully and much more actively than it had ever done in the past. And that is, again, because the world was changing. He was very well known in Washington. This may be of interest to you, I don't know, but he was largely seen as the allied leader who could work closest with President Trump. We jokingly referred to Abe-san as the Trump whisperer. He managed access to the White House where others wouldn't. But what you might not know is that when I was in DC at the council, I had numerous allied diplomats come to me and say, how is he doing it? How is he getting this done? How does he communicate? Even the Chinese embassy sent people to visit. And so Abe was respected greatly for his ability to manage the United States at a time, let's say, when our decision-making was quite erratic and our allies were less than clear about what direction we wanted to go. And so again, there's a lot to Mr. Abe that I know his domestic reputation doesn't account for, but it's an important, his leadership and his legacy are incredibly critical. Sorry. Now we're catching up. Okay. The other thing about Mr. Abe, and this is the domestic politics side that's very important, he didn't do this all by himself. And I think what a lot of policymakers either don't realize or forget is that he had a 2/3 majority in the lower house of parliament for his entire time in office. He managed to do a lot of those security reforms, a Secrecy Act, right? Reinterpreting Article 9 of the Constitution and then passing laws that allowed them to be implemented. A lot of what he got through the Diet was done because the LDP and Komeito coalition maintained that 2/3 majority. So his leadership is critical, his mindset was critical, but so too was the dominance of the LDP and Komeito in the Diet. So let's shift gears, another slide. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at what's happening now. And I'll explain a little bit about what the Kishida cabinet announced last December. It's important, there's a lot of factors that can come into this equation. This was the product, these documents, a new national security strategy, only the second in Japan's history, a new 10-year national defense plan. For those of you who are Japanese and follow this, this is of course the Taiko, and then a 5-year procurement plan that was attached to the 10-year national defense plan. The strategic review was conducted inside the Liberal Democratic Party by their Defense Commission, led by a former Minister of Defense. It was undertaken by the National Security Secretariat, which is subsumed under the Prime Minister's office, and it was obviously also conducted inside the major bureaucracies, which includes the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Finance, and the police agency. So this was a whole, across-the-board government and party effort to rethink what Japan needed to do to maintain its security, and it was a pretty comprehensive, what we call in Washington, a whole of government approach to the topic. What's interesting, and I won't quote the document, you guys can go online, you can find it easily, you can read it, and I certainly urge you to do so, whether you're a Japan expert or you're interested in the region more broadly. The thing to remember is the national security strategy doesn't start with military power, it starts with diplomacy, first and foremost. It then goes on to Japan's economic strength and to its military strength. So again, back to this idea that there are different levers of statecraft. This was embodied in this new document. Threat assessment was very conspicuously a part of the strategy, something that had been downplayed in the first national security strategy. China, North Korea, and Russia specifically are named. But it was also interesting, if you read it with this kind of mindset, it was an interesting document to look at how the Japanese decision-making community wanted to pursue national power. And I don't say that as that Japan is seeking to expand its national power, but it is not only response to external environment, but what were the elements of Japanese national power that the Japanese government wanted to maintain and preserve. You'll find some interesting ways of thinking about that in that document. It embraces change. This is the first basic Japanese document that I've read that says this is the biggest change since the end of World War II. Japanese diplomats and bureaucrats, no offense intended, hopefully none taken, but say we're about to change policy wholesale is not normally what Japanese policymakers do. They normally say, well, it's a slow, incremental effort to modulate, right? But the language in this document is, hey, pay attention. We are changing. And there was a deliberate attempt to signal outside the country, right? And so I think the signal was heard loud and clear in exactly the places where it was intended, which is Pyongyang, Beijing, perhaps Moscow, and certainly in Washington, D.C. But it was focused on the Indo-Pacific, but it was global in scope in terms of what Japan is seeking to accomplish. Now, the part that got all the headlines in the media, and of course the part that's very striking, is the 10-year defense plan. It was its 5-year implementation plan. Again, another unmistakable place where Japanese intentions were communicated very crisply and clearly. The double investment in security, 2% of GDP. That's double what Japan currently dedicates to its security, be it national military planning or its Coast Guard and other aspects of security. It is commensurate with the NATO guidelines, so that's something, again, for those of you interested in the details. The Japanese government looked very closely at NATO guidelines for spending, for national spending, and organized their thoughts that way. Second, it introduced long-range strike, and so this is what a lot of people were alarmed by or surprised by. I think you should be neither alarmed nor surprised. It's been on the docket for at least a decade, if not longer. But it is an extension of Japan, what the Japanese self-defense force refers to as standoff capability. And what they mean by that is that their air and maritime and even their ground forces want to take the fight out away from Japanese territory. So you've got coastal defense missiles by the ground self-defense forces that go out a couple hundred miles. You've got a new air self-defense missile that's going to be purchased from Norway that takes it another 300 or 400 miles. And then the Japanese government now is talking to the United States about purchase of Tomahawk cruise missiles, which takes it out another 600 to 800 miles. So the important thing here is this is Japan trying to push back any attempt at military pressure beyond its territorial defenses, in other words, beyond the place where civilian Japanese may be affected. And that's the way the the self-defense forces across the board think about this. Last thing I'll say about the 10-year defense plan that's really important that you recognize, and I have never seen a 10-year defense plan that looks like this. It is across the board reform. It runs the gamut of organizational reforms, so a new permanent joint operational command will be formed for the 3 services of Japan's self-defense force. For those of you who watched the response to the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, the Japanese themselves couldn't talk to each other and didn't have a standing command structure. They had to build one in the moment. And then, by extension, they couldn't talk to the Americans who came to help as well. So this has been on the minds of the self-defense forces for a long time. The civilian leadership now thinks it's overdue as well. It's things like hardening airfields and ports, allowing for the self-defense force to use civilian facilities and ports in the future. It is stockpiling munitions and fuels. For those of you who've been watching Ukraine, you'll know why. And then it's space, cyber, human resource development. If anybody here is Japanese and has cyber capabilities, your Ministry of Defense wants you. 4,000 people, in fact, is what they would like. So just in case there's a job search underway. The bigger thing that I thought was interesting is the rethinking of government innovation R&D budgets. In the past, civilian R&D was always the focus of government technological innovation research in Japan. Military R&D was the Ministry of Defense. It was separated, and people wanted it that way. That is no longer going to be the case. The Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will now be on the National Innovation R&D Commission. So again, whole of government approach. I could go on with other things that I noted, but this is not an effort that is going to be over soon. It is an effort that's going to require the 2% of GDP investments. It is a wholesale reform and doubling down on Japanese capabilities. It is a catch-up game in the region. I think it's probably, well, let me say before that slide's good, but let me just say a couple of things while you kind of absorb that slide. Another word about politics. Again, as somebody who's watched this and wrote a book about it in 2019, what I was surprised at was how little opposition there was, political party opposition, how little public opposition there was in Japan to these documents that came out in December. There were questions about implementation, and of course the Prime Minister started talking about a defense tax. And that got everybody a little alarmed that their taxes would go up. But the purpose and the goals of the strategy, the purpose and the goals of the 10-year National Defense Plan, very little criticism. And I looked for it, believe me, I was looking, because that's not normally the way national military planning proceeds in Japan. The one thing I think will draw some criticism, in addition to the defense tax, will be the purchase of U.S. Tomahawks and the deployment of that long-range strike. So I think we're not out of the woods yet. The government will get lots of pushback still about implementation questions. The second piece, and we'll talk more about it when Jerry and I chat, is how all of this will be integrated with the United States. There will be an alliance conversation to come that takes all of this on board. So is Japan unleashed? Has Japan become a military power writ large? That slide was just designed to keep things in perspective, right? Again, I'm not here to count bombs and bullets and everything, but this doubling of Japanese investment is by no means going to be able to shift dramatically the regional military balance of power, but it will begin to set Japan back on a little bit different footing, especially when it's coupled with the United States in the region. So that's just to remind you that there are other parties in the region that have been expanding their defense spending much, much faster. Let's just go back to, let's go out of the military sphere for a second and talk a little bit about diplomacy. Again, this doesn't often get pulled together when we think strategy. We often go to the bombs and the bullets, right? But the reality is Japan has been working on its strategic diplomacy in the region with other partners, notably India, Australia, and us, as well as with Europe now for almost a decade. So let's just go to the region real quick. Japan and Southeast Asia, I just put together some slides to show you the range of relationships that Japan has been and is building with countries in Southeast Asia. So if you start on the left, you'll see the Chief of Staff of the Joint Staff meeting with the senior or the Deputy Defense Minister and the senior uniformed leader in Vietnam. That's a partnership that's been ongoing now for at least 8 years, formally ongoing for at least 8 years. Vietnam is also a maritime power. Vietnam is also concerned about the maritime behavior of China. And so Japan has had a fairly close conversation with Vietnam. The other place that surprises a lot of people, if you look to the top, is the recent deepening of cooperation between Japan and the Philippines. Of course, during the Abe administration, you'll remember the Philippines and the United States had a little bit of a rough time. Different president in the Philippines at the time, but didn't take kindly to our president, President Obama at the time. And we had quite a rift, frankly, between the United States and the Philippines at the top level. Japan very quietly, and this is Prime Minister Abe's initiative, he very quietly began to talk to Duterte, to talk about the kinds of things the United States might talk to the Philippines about, but couldn't at the time. So he kept the conversation going by interceding and somewhat talking about Philippine maritime security, and they have a very robust bilateral Japan-Philippine capacity building program as a result. I thought this was interesting. In December, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force landed jets in the Philippines. Anybody who is a historian in the room will understand what that means. In World War II, of course, the landing of Japanese jets was not very welcome in the Philippines. There weren't jets back then, but you know what I mean. So this is a whole new relationship with the Philippines and Japan. Again, to the right, you'll see the Prime Minister of Singapore, Prime Minister Lee, and the Prime Minister Kishida last year signed a defense technology transfer agreement. So again, think about World War II and the residual sentiments in Singapore. Today, not only do Japanese Self-Defense Force ships dock and get serviced in Singapore, and they have done for decades, they now have a defense technology sharing agreement that will be fairly significant. And then finally, the Kirisame is one of the larger Japanese, one of the largest class destroyers. Most recently visited the Solomon Islands out in the Pacific Islands to demonstrate Japanese interest in what is happening out there. For those of you who aren't following what's happening out there, of course, the Chinese have been attempting to build relationships with the Pacific Islands and in particular with the Solomons. So Japan has provided aid, has provided other kinds of development assistance, but today Japan also is demonstrating military presence in a way that's very different than in the past. And that's in its neighborhood where there are sometimes delicate feelings about Japan's past. The next relationship, Susie, with the next slide, is the obvious one, I guess, for those of you interested in the Indo-Pacific, is the Quad. The United States and Japan, this is where I think the leadership of Prime Minister Abe has been most notable in terms of regional approaches and American sort of convergence on the need for much more focused and sustained interest on rethinking regional leadership in the Indo-Pacific. The free and open Indo-Pacific vision that Abe and his team crafted while he was still in office, of course, was embraced by his successor. So you see Mr. Suga down there, and then obviously Mr. Kishida. This is something that Japan believes very strongly in, and Abe himself was instrumental in getting the Quad engagement going. So when President Biden came in January, very quickly you started to see leadership meetings that brought the Quad leaders together. The first, of course, was virtual, as you can see on the screen, by necessity, but then was carefully managed in September of 2021 in person, and then last May, of course, Japan hosted it in Tokyo. By mid this year, 2023, Australia will host the next Quad leaders meeting, an in-person meeting. We can talk more about what the Quad is up to, but I just wanted to point out that the diplomacy piece of what Japan is doing in terms of shaping its environment and strategically building coalitions with us and sometimes without us is really pretty important. The last slide, Susie, is for many of you you will think is all about Russia invading Ukraine, but the groundwork of Japanese engagement with NATO allies has been in the mix for some time. So you had a fairly strong interest with Japan and the NATO powers since the end of the Cold War, but then binational, bilateral ties evolving. The middle picture at the top was the part that Russia helped to provoke with its invasion, and that is Prime Minister Kishida attending the Madrid NATO summit last summer, and the encouragement also of other U.S. allies to join too. So President Yoon was there from South Korea, as was the Prime Minister of Australia. The last three pictures clockwise from 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock is the G7 tour that Prime Minister Kishida took this January. So he was there in Italy meeting the Prime Minister Maloney. He's Prime Minister Sunak in London, and obviously President Macron. In all three of these capitals, he concluded defense arrangements, defense agreements. With Italy and the UK, Japan will be leading a consortium to build the next generation combat support fighter. This is something that, for those of you who have a long memory to the 1980s, we talked about the FX project, which failed because the United States wasn't happy about Japan taking the lead at the time. Today, Japan now will be taking the lead in the development of a new joint combat support fighter with Italian and British assistance. Pretty important departure. With Macron, of course, there is the French have been very interested in the Indo-Pacific. Mr. Abe encouraged this interest in the Indo-Pacific. All of these powers, well, except for Italy, all France, UK, Germany, the EU, all now have Indo-Pacific strategies, thanks to the encouragement of first Prime Minister Abe and then Prime Minister Kishida. So now you're seeing not only demand signals being sent out to Europe, but also European interest in engaging Japan much, much more wholesomely in security cooperation and defense industry cooperation. Prime Minister Kishida in May will host the G7 which, as you all know, has become the venue for the response to the Russian invasion. Japan this time has kept pace with the sanctioning of Russia. It did not in 2014, but it has today, and assistance to Ukraine as well. We can talk more about that later. Japan is also sitting as a non-permanent member in the UN Security Council starting in January this year. So in two of the largest venues for discussion about international norms, especially norms that are critical of aggression, norms of non-proliferation, etc., international security norms, Japan now has a seat and is in fact a very active partner with others around the globe. So let's go to my conclusion, because I know I'm probably talking for too long and I want to hear what's on your mind and talk to Jerry, because that's what I came up for, so we could chat about what this means. Let me just lay out where I see some of the challenges going forward. I couldn't resist the opportunity to use the Defense of Japan white paper cover. This is not, this was Defense Minister Kishida. It's a Sumie artist who did this, but of course when the defense white paper came out and we all saw it, we went, wow, that's a little forward-leaning. It has since gone back to a nice sort of mundane Defense of Japan white cover, but it certainly attracted a little bit of attention, so I thought I would share that with you. So let's run through really quickly where I see Tokyo policymakers and strategic thinkers will be focused. Sorry, next slide. Don't forget about North Korea. We are so focused these days on China, now Russia, that it's easy to forget that the North Koreans last year in 2022 tested double or more different kinds of missiles than they did in 2017, which you'll remember was the Fire and Fury year. This is a serious threat for Japan, and it is also part of the rationale for the Tomahawk, the move to a counterstrike capability. Ballistic missile defenses are insufficient for the kinds of capabilities that North Korea currently maintains and has demonstrated that it has not only different distances in which it can shoot people, it has a huge arsenal of capability. And so that would override any ballistic missile defense system that Japan could field, or we could field for that matter. So this is part of the reason that Japan is moving towards a counter-strike capability. The reason I put these sort of text messages, this is again from the year of Fire and Fury, but there's a different dimension I think people don't often appreciate, and that is the civil defense piece of policymaking. The North Korean missile launches have promoted, and this goes back to about 2013 when launches went over Okinawa. It was the first time that the cell phone emergency alerts were issued to those who were under the pathway of a missile by North Korea. This is Hokkaido. It's for those of you who read Japanese, you'll be able to read it. For those of you who don't, it's from the Internal Affairs Ministry, so it's not a national defense text. It's basically saying, don't touch it. If something lands, don't touch it. Call the fire department or the police. It's very gentle civil defense. But there's been a lot, of course, to take it more seriously in the last August, and we'll talk about that in a second, when the Chinese PLA were doing exercises around Taiwan designed to tell us how they would boycott Taiwan in case of a crisis. Of course, some of the missiles they tested went into Japan's EEZ, and now you have a fairly active conversation among the people of the outer islands down south of Okinawa with the central government. What do we do? How are we going to be defended? How are you going to protect us? And that's an element that's not so much on the surface, but it is a very critical component of Japanese thinking today about its security. Us, our capabilities in the region. This is one of those big slides that our military likes to put together. So I'll let you just look at it and absorb it. And anybody who wants my slide pack can have it if you're interested in the details. But this is really about our attempt, our being the United States' Indo-Pacific Command's attempt to think about how to respond to the growing number of missiles maintained by China. Those of you interested in arms control may know that we have stepped out in 2019 of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which we had with Russia, largely because of the capabilities that Russia was developing, contradicted the intent of that treaty, and so the United States also stepped out. China has never been a member of a negotiated arms control agreement, so Professor Christensen here is the expert on this, so I won't say too much about China, but the reality is that we don't have a framework for talking with China about the threat, but also the strategic utility of these weapons We don't understand each other, other than they have a lot, so we are going to have a lot too. It sounds a little simplistic, but that's actually what we're doing, is to try to create more deterrence in the region. Our Congress, of course, will have a lot of influence over this in terms of budgeting, et cetera. But this is another piece of the puzzle for Japan. What is the United States going to do to ensure it has sufficient deterrent capability in the region? Next challenge. Challenge number 3 is what is going on? And of course, again, we could spend a whole lecture on this question. Not so clear, right? So the Biden administration most recently began to talk about the possibility that China was considering transfer of lethal armaments to Russia to help with the Ukraine war. I'm not sure where that is right now, but the diplomacy is certainly indicating that Russia and China have an awful lot to talk about. They may not have convergent interests in Ukraine, but they certainly have a lot to talk about when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And so for over a decade now, you've witnessed Japanese and, Susie, you can go to the next slide, Chinese and Russian exercises. When the Quad meeting was held last May in Tokyo, the Russian and Chinese strategic bombers circumnavigated Japan as a kind of demonstration that they were paying attention. This is more recent. When I was in Tokyo in November, I went to the joint staff to get a briefing and talk about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has affected their perceptions of Russian threat in the region. And this is the first, this is in the Defense White Paper, it's completely public. This is the first exercise they talked about. So qualitatively speaking, the way in which the Chinese and Russian militaries are operating in and around Japan now is changing, and the Japanese can see that, and the extent to which it's changing is fairly impressive and worrisome. There was a joint staff tweet. You can all follow the Japanese military on Twitter, by the way, if you're interested in the nuts and bolts. But there was a tweet that went out this morning that talked about between March 2nd and March 5th, which is yesterday, the self-defense forces were scrambling in the Sea of Okhotsk, the Sea of Japan. They didn't say South China Sea, but they suggested to the southwest and the Pacific Ocean. So Japanese air self-defense force and maritime forces are on 24/7 alert. They are busy dealing with the kinds of exercises and presence in the region that you see here. Last, and then I'll stop. The last challenge is us and our politics. Now, I'm not gonna say anything about whether our elected leaders and our speakers of the House should do this or should do that. But it is a question about our politics, especially between now and 2024 when we have a presidential election. It is going to heat up. Our challenging behavior, the congressional discussion about China has begun, in a particular committee. You can watch it if you're scared. I'm scared when I watch it, but there's just a wholesale investigation of what kind of policies the United States should have and what kinds of behaviors by China the United States should respond to. Not all of these are bad things, by the way, but it is a deeply politicized conversation on the Hill at the moment. And Tom, you can comment. Please do comment on your perception as well. But this is what happened after Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan last August. The islands that I mentioned that had missiles that close by, the Japanese islands, you can see them. They're the little white specks to the right of Taiwan there. But this is what the PLA did in the wake of the Pelosi visit. Not during the visit, but after it happened. And from my China experts, I understand that this is the first time that China had a combined exercise that was dedicated to demonstrate to us what they would be capable of doing should they decide that they were going to unilaterally take Taiwan by force. Now, there's a heated debate in our China community, and this is not my territory, so I will give it back to the experts. But the reality is our politics and our decision-making on China reverberate across the region in ways that aren't often appreciated in Washington, D.C. So this is a challenge for Japanese planners. It's a challenge for Taiwanese planners. It's a challenge for everybody in the region. And it's a challenge, I think, that leaders in Tokyo will take to heart seriously in the next 2 years as we approach our presidential election. So the world is changing. It's changing fast. It's changing in ways we cannot predict, and that you can just be an armchair watcher of the TV to know that that's happening. Japan is moving quickly to try to catch up, because Japan has been a fairly steady state, slow change. Don't ruffle the feathers. Make sure the Japanese people aren't too upset. And all these are good things in a democracy. This is what the public and the government do in every democracy. But the world is not sitting still. And so this decision-making, the documents that were issued last December, was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call that the Japanese people did not oppose, however. There were no demonstrations on the streets. There was no opposition party taking a punch at the Liberal Democratic Party. It was very quiet. My sense is, and I'm looking forward to hearing Jerry's comments, is the Japanese people are worried, and they want their government to do what it needs to do to keep up with the changes in the region. For all of you who are going on to careers in public policy, it is a great time to be a Japan expert. It is a great time to invest in the languages and the history and the politics of the countries that we need to build coalitions with over the next decade or longer. So I'm delighted to be back to Columbia. Congratulations, Jerry, on the new initiative. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So there's several things I want to get you to talk a little bit more about, and I'll express my views. So, we know that what happened in December, with the national security strategy, defense strategy, this didn't come out of the blue. There's been an evolution, and Prime Minister Abe's role in moving the ball forward was just huge.
Right.
And so, when he was Prime Minister, there was a lot that he did that many people didn't appreciate, didn't like, especially on the domestic issues or on the domestic side of foreign policy issues. Of course, he was very much on the right, and saw things like Article 9 as being more than the military issue.
Right.
It's about somehow finally getting rid of occupation,
Right.
American occupation reforms. That's 70 years ago. But he was a strategic thinker, and I think he really had a good grasp of what was going on in the region and globally, and also what options Japan had. So it's not new, and so that goes back to 2013 or so. But even before then, we saw this, Japanese security policy has been evolving right from the beginning. Article 9 didn't mean in 1990 what it meant in 1950, and it doesn't mean now what it's meant until now. That's all true. But the question is, why now? Why in December do you have the government saying, this is a fundamental change? We're doing something very different now. We're going to have counter-strike capability. That is, if a country, if an adversary is about to attack us, we're not going to sit on our hands and wait. We're going to go and take the missile off the launch pad, thousands of miles away from here, right? So there's a lot in the national security strategy and defense strategy that makes you say, why now? And so the answers that I think everybody comes up with, well, there's the concern about China. There's the shock of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But the third point, which I want to draw you out on a little bit on, there's the uncertainty about the United States. There's the realization that we were not able to deter the Russians from invading the Ukraine. To the contrary, we told the Russians, even if you invade Ukraine, we're not going to fight with you. Sort of giving them advance notice that American forces would not be involved. Was that a good idea and a bad idea? You can argue. You could argue that you don't give that away. Make Putin wonder, make him be concerned. But anyway, I think my sense is the Japanese apprehension about whether the Americans whether American deterrent power and extended deterrence will really save the day for Japan. You can't count on it. Since you can't count on it, there are two things Japan has to do. One, be able to do more for itself. Well, three things I guess Japan has to do. Be able to do more for yourself. Diversify your security relationships so that you have more relationships with other countries, Australia, Great Britain, both within the Indo-Pacific but globally. And third, make the alliance stronger, sort of, there's this, there's the argument about abandonment versus entrapment, that in alliance relationships, you worry about being abandoned or being entrapped, but there's something going on with Japan that's different. They worry about being abandoned, so they're kind of trying to entrap the U.S. in a much tighter alliance so that the U.S. would be more, the sense that it would be more reliable. I think that is happening. And the other aspect of the U.S. angle is this great uncertainty about what happens if Trump is elected in 2024. And it's not an impossibility, right? What happens if the U.S. domestic political situation changes in ways that are inimical to Japanese interests? Well, the answer is you're kind of screwed. I think that's the first reaction. And the second is, well, we may be in an impossible situation, but we have to do whatever we can for ourselves. So this tension between the national security strategy representing a Japanese effort to be more autonomous, more independent, at the same time trying to strengthen the alliance, but with not a great deal of confidence that it'll work. I think underlying all of the fact, the reasons why the opposition doesn't oppose, the public doesn't protest, not because they love what the government is doing, but they don't see any option. Well, what's your reaction?
I'm not going to argue with that.
This is our problem.
That's what happens when you're with Senpai Sensei. So let me just a couple of different framings, because you said a lot of things that I would agree with, and I wanted to do a couple of things. One is, I think since the end of the Cold War, Japanese diplomats at least, maybe not Japanese MOD officials, but Japanese diplomats have really looked to NATO to build relationships, to build understanding about how do you deal with this new America who's always wanting you to do things in coalition, right? So that goes back to the Gulf War. It goes back, obviously, to 9/11. So you've got a kind of outreach, and we all know Nogami-san and people like that. When I was working with him at Jaya, he was already thinking we need to learn from those European allies. We need, America's allies got to exchange notes here on how to deal with Washington. So there's a longer term, and I think you're right. What is long term and what is right now? So there's been a diplomatic effort to deepen those relationships. Some of you know Ambassador Ishii, Masa Ishii, and he was sent to Brussels just precisely to do that. So the NATO, U.S. Japan alliances would be talking to each other, but also he was responsible for building the partnership agreement between Japan and NATO. So NATO has a series of partners that it reaches out to and does all kinds of consultations with. This is in part where some of this defense technology opportunity was explored. So I think what you're seeing here is the post-Cold War era was a fairly interesting era for our allies in thinking about how to deal with us. Doesn't mean they didn't think we were reliable, but they had notes to share, they had ideas to share, and Japan, especially on the defense technology side, really wanted to have more options, frankly, than being under the thumb of Lockheed Martin, and forgive me if Lockheed Martin's in the room, but our defense industry has a fairly big presence in Tokyo. We've had foreign military sales, we've had very restricted access to technology, and so the Europeans, there is a little bit of taking a look at the Europeans as perhaps a little bit of other opportunity, and that's a slow build. That's not something you build overnight, something that takes time. So some of this diplomacy and seed sowing is now coming to fruition. The Europeans are anxious to be partnering with not only Japan but others in the Indo-Pacific. They see the geopolitics of the world now being, and pre-Russian invasion, of course, being shaped by the rise of China, being shaped by the challenge to maritime stability and the norms of maritime security. Free seas, free oceans, right? They see our capability. Of course, our capability is not what it once was, right? We are not building ships as fast as we used to. We are not convinced as a people that we should be defending everybody. And so you've had a Republican and, well, you've had two Democratic administrations, and I don't know, pre-Obama, I'll leave to other people, but who have understood that the United States people, the public, is tired of being the global policeman. I mean, that is a very strong strain in our politics. Sure. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican administration, you heard it in the Obama administration, you heard it in the Trump administration, more crudely articulated, to be sure, but and Biden himself has also been heard to talk about, you know, more of that, more help from our allies. Our withdrawal from Afghanistan, case in point. Very similar policy between Trump and Biden on that one, right? So the Japanese who are in government and the Japanese who are watching us outside of government, they're very keen observers of our politics, and they may not be comfortable always with the choices that we make, but they see the trend lines. They understand that in the American presidential elections now, we are raising fundamental questions about why are we allied with these people actually? Why don't they just defend themselves? I mean, and the president of the United States in the last administration was one of those people. So I'm not here to be partisan. I'm just saying that I think our Japanese colleagues understand this. I don't know that I would say in the defense community that there is concern about would we respond should there be a use of force against Japan. So I think Article 5 protections and our restatement of those protections, Senkaku, for example, but I don't know if anybody was paying attention to the last 2+2 agreement in January, we extended Article 5 protections to space. Yeah. So we are beginning to see clear reassurances being given at the behest of Tokyo to make sure that the Japanese public and the self-defense forces who have to operate understand that we will be there, and we will be there in these new domains. We will be there in this tiny little uninhabited set of islands that may not seem that the Americans should care too much about. This is negotiated over time. So reliability is a diplomatic conversation. Reassurance is a diplomatic tool. The Biden administration, the Trump administration, and the Obama administration have all given the reassurances. The last piece of reassurance, and I think this is going to be an interesting space for you students interested in this topic to follow, and that is the upgrade of our extended deterrence dialogue with Japan. Now, for those of you who study South Korea, you will have noticed that President Yoon of late has started to talking about a nuclear conversation with the United States. In South Korean politics, it is out in the open that there is more demand now for, if not our tactical nukes, then maybe South Korea should get their own. That is not out and about in Japanese politics unless somebody here has seen it somewhere that I have not. But there is deeper interest in elevating the extended deterrence dialogue. So it will now be raised to, if not a vice ministerial, and perhaps even to the cabinet level. So you're looking at elevation of topics that, in effect, the Japanese government, for political reasons, wanted to keep fairly practical and technical at a lower level of government. This, too, is part of not only reassurance, but part of getting the fine-tuning and the fine-grained understanding of what American strategic assets are coming and when. Yeah. And so there's a whole host of conversations now that the alliance will be having that they didn't need or didn't really want to have as openly.
Sure, well, that's really interesting. And I just want to make just one more point on this. I want to move on to something else. But what you just mentioned, the Koreans are talking about nuclear weapons. Public support for going nuclear is quite strong.
It's growing.
And it's growing. And in Japan, that's not true yet. But that doesn't mean it'll be like this always. So, the national security strategy is not the end point of an evolution of Japanese security policy. There will be more evolution depending on what happens in the environment. And so the idea of, Abe, before he died, was talking about nuclear sharing, and it's not any longer, to me, inconceivable that Japan, the only country to actually be attacked with nuclear weapons, with a prime minister who comes from Hiroshima and has always made sort of the elimination of nuclear weapons a goal, which is impossible.
Right.
It's not inconceivable, given all the terrible things that are going on in the world, that this issue is going to take on more weight, more meaning in the coming years.
And I would watch the Hiroshima meeting, the G7 meeting, because there's a new way for Japan and all of us, frankly, to talk about it, which is not nuclear disarmament as we traditionally think of it. It is mitigating the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. If one thing that Putin has done, I think that the Japanese public has noticed, as have many others around the globe, is he has begun to threaten the use of escalatory dynamics that would lead to the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
He's attempting to erase the kind of moral threshold that I think most people around the globe feel is still in place, that nuclear weapons should never be used again. And Japan has always been in the front of that conversation.
That's a really good point.
Mitigating the risk of the use of nuclear weapons is a different conversation, but it's an important one to have in the wake of the Russian aggression.
Yeah. So a couple of other things I want to raise, and I do want to just have enough time for the questions. But so the national security strategy is a policy document. It's a piece of paper or several pieces of paper. But what actually happens is a question of implementation. And there are many more problems of implementation than you were able to get into today, or that most people are aware of, including things like new national security strategy. Emphasize the diplomatic first, then the economic, then military. That's what you said, and that's true. But the fact is, there was recently a meeting of the G20 foreign ministers, and the Japanese foreign minister couldn't go because the parliament wouldn't give him permission to leave the country. This is ridiculous, but this is the situation, that there are so many constraints on what the government can do. And there's a mindset, there's been a lot of change, but this idea, the idea that you can skip the foreign ministers meeting because, and the reason was it was a meeting of the budget committee, thing of the upper house. And in the budget committee, all members of the cabinet have to be there all day, sitting on their behind from morning till late afternoon, so that they can answer a question if they're asked. And so I haven't seen it in the paper. I saw it in the paper the other day. So Foreign Minister Hayashi did not go to the G20, so he'd be available, and he did comment. He did speak. 53 seconds. Do you give up being at the G20 for that?
It's crazy.
There's more of that kind of thing. There's issues about privacy that make very difficult good cybersecurity policy in Japan. There are many other things. Double the budget, double the GNP spent on defense. But they haven't figured out yet how to pay for it. Kishida talked about raising taxes, got slammed down by his own party. And obviously the public doesn't like taxes. So this year they're finagling a deal where they're using non-tax monies that are already available to pay this year's increase in the defense budget. But at some point they have to make up their mind how they're going to pay for this. So the implementation of a lot will be done, but there's probably a lot that's not going to be done. And so, it'd be dangerous to have excessive expectations for change in Japan. We've seen many false dawns, especially on the economic side, about Japanese policy and domestic reform, structural change and all that. All kinds of brave things being said, and then relatively little being done. There'll be a lot done. I'm not trying to say that there won't be a lot done. But I think we need to have a better kind of assessment of what the impediments to implementation are going to be. They're legal. They're kind of the mindset. There's this the insular, with all the talk about having counter-strike capability, reaching out thousands of miles and so on. True enough, but it's still a very insular country. What's your take on what I just said?
Implementation is going to be exactly how you described it, painful. Because it requires a significant amount of shifting of resources from the budget. You know, I took a quick look on the back of the envelope what it would take to double Japan's, to get to 2% of GDP. You know, it's a considerable amount of money every year to get to where they want to go. The other, I think, piece I think most of American defense planners are cognizant of is you can spread money around, but are you actually getting what you want out of it? Are you actually getting the capability or the operational reforms or are you getting what you want to make it possible for you to do what you want to do? So there's two pieces of that budget, please. It's, for people who don't know, Japan's annual budget, about 1/3 of it is debt servicing, about 1/3. Another 1/3 is what we would think of as social security broadly conceived, right? So pensions, healthcare, et cetera. Kishida-san has just gone into the public to say he wants to raise subsidies for childbearing families considerably. They've just begun issuing bonds for renewable energy. So there's other things in the mix that are going to add to the budget, not just the defense. So there's a zero-sum reality that is going to hit, I think, whatever prime minister we have. Can I reverse roles for just a second? Can I ask you a question?
I don't know. It depends on the question. Go ahead.
All right. So beyond the wonky policy stuff, what is your read on Kishida's the politics in Japan? Is he staying or is he going?
Is he staying or is he going?
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen? Because a lot of this is associated with the kind of political stability that Abe had over time.
I think he's staying.
Right?
I think he's staying.
But that's a remarkable performance to come afterwards. So you think he's staying for, so go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the issue right now in the domestic politics is that there really isn't anybody who appears to be someone that the public would like to see being the leader, and there's no one that the LDP can agree on. So you might as well stick with what you got, especially since everything he's doing on the foreign policy side is exactly what Prime Minister Abe's faction wants him to do, and probably a good reason why he's doing what he's doing on the foreign policy side is precisely because the Abe faction wants him to do it. I don't say that counts for everything, but the thing with Mr. Kishida is it's really very hard for me to figure out what he really believes is important, and besides wanting to remain prime minister. And I think that's the way the public sees him, that he's a nice guy, he's a real gentleman, nice person, who wants to study everything, Kento Suru, he's got this nickname of, Mr. Kento Suru-san. Everything they're going to look into, he looks into it and looks into it. Not much is happening on the domestic side. Even to talk about, child care and so on. Anything that's controversial, like opening up the immigration system so that more people come in who could be nannies. It's a really important thing. If a lot of women are working, then you want to have people who will take care of the babies. And you want people to have more children, and you want the women to work, but you don't want anybody to come into the country who's actually going to help take care of their children. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to know that's not going to work. But it's too controversial, so he stays away from it. But I think one of the ironies is that one reason why the policies on this national security strategy have gone down without much opposition is that if Kishida is doing it, it's not like Abe. Abe was more of a right-wing leaning guy, and if he's doing it, he has some really, really nefarious objectives in mind. That's where a lot of people saw him. But Kishida, well, if he says this is, if he's doing it, it's kind of more acceptable. Yeah. It's really strange that the guy who has this reputation of being a dove is the one who can get away with the biggest change in military thinking and military strategy in Japan since Mr. Yoshida, as you said. But Kishida's no Yoshida. Abe's the Yoshida, as you correctly noted. So given all that I've just said, what's the incentive for the LDP to push him out? There is none. Not until the next lower house election comes. And if it looks like he's really unpopular, he's not very popular now, but he's hanging around 35, 40%, I think, popularity. He's not really popular, but he's not that he's not unpopular. But if the election comes and he's raised taxes to pay for doubling the defense budget and other things the public doesn't like, well, he'll be gone. But he won't be gone until then.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions there?
No, you covered it really nicely. Thank you.
Finally, this is my last way, and then it's an opportunity to get Tom in this conversation.
Yes.
You know, one of the things about Japanese diplomatic style is, especially in dealing with the U.S., but not only with the U.S., you know, you kind of avoid direct confrontation. You kind of avoid saying, you know what, I really disagree with you. And you try to be somewhat more subtle to get the message across. But I think on China relations, there's a lot there's a lot of support, of course, for taking a very tough line on China on security issues, because the Japanese feel threatened. But there's a lot of concern. The Americans are going kind of crazy with this decoupling and China containment, and China's our enemy. We better face up to that reality and do something about it now before it's too late. That is not the way Japanese see the situation, the way to deal with China. Look, it's the biggest trading partner, not only for Japan, for just about everybody. You want to try to get along with it. Japan has a long history of relations with China and very deep connections to China. They know a lot more about dealing with China than we do, in many ways. But Kishida comes to Washington. Does he talk about it? No. It's hi, Joe. Joe. That's another thing. I saw there was some one of the, when Kishida was in town. It was, I don't know, 4 or 5 minute, or 3 or 4 minute clip, and he says, "Joe, it's great to see you again." And then Biden says, "Mr. Prime Minister, I'm so glad you're here." Never once did he call him Fumio. And every time he said, "Mr. Prime Minister," then Joe would find it some way to say Joe at least 10 times. And it's so demeaning. It's inappropriate. But, you know, the idea that you have to have a good relationship with Joe. You have to have a good relationship with the U.S. And that's the way to do it. That's really not changed very much. Abe never would have done that, by the way. Yeah. So I don't say, so Kishida's gone back to kind of an older style of, and it concerns me because we really need to be able to listen to what our allies, and especially Japan, thinks about what we should be doing about China. How do you deal with China? Whether this enthusiasm for an industrial policy to prevent the Chinese from growing. Man, you know, we were around when that was our biggest criticism of Japan, right, was that they had this industrial policy which really wasn't going to work and it was unfair. Yeah. But now we're going to say to the Chinese, and that's what we're going to do to you, just what the Japanese try to do us. And you know what? We're going to fail just like the Japanese failed. All right, enough of the conversation. Let's get some
all around.
Questions, comments. Okay, Tom Christensen, Professor.
Yes. It's going to be a long question.
I just like to drink before I speak. I just had a question about the U.S. Japan Alliance from a different angle, and you made a very convincing speech about how the domestic politics in Japan have shifted away from what the Americans used to accuse Japan of being, a free rider, that you're not going to contribute to your own defense, and we're going to get a doubling of the defense budget. And a lot of the urging of Japan to take a larger role had always been resisted by Japanese politicians with reference to domestic politics. Couldn't possibly do it. Wasn't in the realm of possibility. for Japan to play a larger role. But there was another form of domestic politics in Japan that was problematic for the U.S. Japan Alliance, and it wasn't national domestic politics, it was a local domestic politics, particularly in Okinawa, where the major bases are. And I'm interested in your views about those local politics now in the context of one thing that is very important in the U.S. Military doctrine as it evolves in the face of the rise of China and the challenges that the rise of China poses for the United States. And that is the idea that the U.S. doctrine in the region needs to move away from fixed bases like those in Okinawa for a much more mobile force. The Marines have a mobile doctrine, the Army has a mobile doctrine, the Air Force has a mobile doctrine, and now the Navy has a mobile doctrine. All the major American services have mobile doctrines. Mobile doctrines require places from which to operate. So my question to you is that traditional problem of the local politics of Okinawa, the kind of not in my backyard type of politics that all countries have, and this newer problem of where can the United States be sure that we'll be able to operate in Japan outside of the traditional locations, and will the Japanese national population and the local populations affected by such a change be receptive to those new doctrines? I mean, this is true for the Philippines, this is true for other places from which the United States might operate in the region, but it's particularly important because Japan is really the linchpin of the U.S. presence in Northeast Asia. And just wanted to say I really loved your talk, and sessions like this is why I came back to Columbia. So.
Thank you. So Tom, there's a lot in there really important question, and kind of a tour de force of all the issues, but let me try to address a couple of them, if that's okay. So one is the dispersal idea, of course, comes out of thinking about not base use, but actually redundancy and utility of how we're going to operate, not only as a U.S. military, but with our allies as well. I think the Okinawa base issue will always be the Okinawa base issue, in particular because of the history of Okinawa and because of the land use policies there. But what was also striking is at a point at which the Japanese were going to deploy a land-based Aegis system, which was a land-based ballistic missile defense system, for those of you who are not military watchers, but it was up in Akita. And it was going to be the Japanese military that was going to run the ballistic missile defense system from Akita. And a very conservative governor of Akita took on the Ministry of Defense and says, I don't think so. So there's more to the story than that, but it is not just an Okinawa problem. As Japan gets more sophisticated systems, and the Tomahawks, at least for now, I believe are going to be sea-based, not land-based. So that's very important about the Tomahawk piece. But you're still going to have to engage with the United States and Japan are still going to have to engage on the what-ifs about Taiwan, which comes to mind as the most prevalent question, way to think about your question in the near term. And that is, what do we want, the United States, what do we want Japan to do, and how do we want to use those bases and facilities in the case of a contingency in Taiwan? Well, that's all Okinawa, not exclusively Okinawa, but concentrated flow through in Okinawa is going to be really critical. What's in the defense plan that was announced last December that's intriguing to me is, and I mentioned it in the talk, which is hardening of airfields, civilian airfields for the self-defense force, and access to civilian ports, deepening civilian ports for the self-defense force. So I think what we're going to see, and we'll see this play out a little bit as Japan's military self-defense force attempt to make some of these changes. And then the follow-through would be in a contingency scenario where it would be U.S. forces also who would use these facilities. But I think the politics of base use by the United States and Japan has been quietly and slowly moving to a shared use philosophy. And that means the flag is not the American flag, it is a Japanese flag. And I think you're watching the ground self-defense forces in particular, but not exclusively, move into this idea that shared basing in Okinawa in particular will put the Japanese self-defense forces on the front line of community management and discussion and deliberation. So that's a less visible process. It's not a fast process. And of course, it requires the American military to agree to play by the rules that the self-defense forces have to play by when it comes to exercising and all kinds of things. So there is a quiet move in that direction, but I'm not sure it's going to be in time for a potential contingency over Taiwan. But those things will come up most acutely when the U.S. and Japan begin that conversation, which they haven't openly yet begun to do.
Good. No.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I got two questions. Number one is, when you try to research about Japan, did you refer to works by Richard Nisbett? He did like a lot of research about Japanese thinking, psychology, and stuff. I don't know whether you know.
I know his name, but I don't. When I do the security stuff, I don't.
Okay. My question is about India, the U.S., and Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So Japan has a new economic security plan,
Yes.
which came out before the national security plan. You have the IPEF, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, and now India is becoming the darling of the West. CFR had an event about that. Asia Society is going to have an event. My question is, with the decoupling plan Japan is thinking about, do you see an influx of investment into India? And the dilemma that Indians have, because G20 meeting, they wouldn't even acknowledge that. They wouldn't say anything about the Russians,
Right.
And Americans are seeing India to be the next kind of China with investments.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the relationship between Japanese investment and Indian reception of that investment? Thank you.
Great question. So let me do little bits, the bits I know about, because I don't follow the up-to-date figures on Japanese investment in India. But on the economic security legislation that you mentioned that Japan passed almost a year before these strategic documents, it was a framework for thinking about many of the things that you mentioned in your comments, but also that the Europeans have been thinking about, things like identifying a list of critical technologies that would be protected and patents would be classified. There is a list of sort of what we think of as supply chain resilience initiatives, including what we're now referring to as friendshoring. So you see the Japanese and TSMC and Sony now have a plant that they're building for semiconductor production in Kumamoto, and there's a second plant that is in the offing. I don't know where it is yet, but there's a second semiconductor plant. So obviously supply chain resiliency is for critical technology is really important. What's in that plan that these two issues, of course, are going to involve the engagement of the Japanese private sector. And there was private sector advisory groups that were part of the preparation for the legislation. But the rubber really meets the road in ministerial ordinances that clarify exactly what critical technologies and how are we going to protect them, what kinds of supply chain challenges, and who bureaucratically is going to be in charge of that. There are two other pieces. One is cybersecurity, so protecting critical infrastructure. Shinkansen, the trains, electricity, nuclear plants, all that kind of stuff is fairly new game. Well, not everybody, not one organization is going to be able to manage all that. There are private sector companies for whom that's going to be a costly enterprise. Who's going to bear the burden, the state or the private sector? So you've got a pretty interesting but very muted conversation going on between the private sector and Japan and this economic security legislation. It's a good space to watch, but the real nuts and bolts haven't been determined yet. So you have to keep an eye on that if that's where your interest lies. I don't know what to say about IPEF other than to say that the United States is not in a position to offer market access to our trading partners, right? Because of our politics. That's a fact. That's not a partisan comment, it's just a reality. IPEF is an attempt to engage economically in the region without the tool of market access. It is a weak strategic lever, but it's better. I think it's better than nothing, and it'll engage on topics such as digital trade. What other things? Things like anti-corruption efforts and taxation codes, nuts and bolts, but for people who trade, actually quite important. It's going to deal a little bit, I believe, with the LNG infrastructure issue as well. And somebody can remind me what the fourth bus basket is, I don't remember. But it's better that we're at the table than we're not, even if we can't do what we really ought to do, which is, do what we've always been doing, which is offer market access. So that's my little commentary. Probably not what you wanted to hear, but that was my commentary on IPEF. The last piece, I guess, is the India piece. And for me, I don't know where Japanese foreign direct investment is today in India. But you've got Korean foreign direct investment, you've got Chinese foreign direct, Japan is not the only game in town when it comes to foreign direct investment in India. I don't know, and maybe some of our Japanese colleagues here know better than I, what the state of play is. I will tell you that overseas development assistance to India has been at the level of 25% and a little higher annually for over a decade. So the Japanese government's assistance to India has certainly, been pretty conspicuous part of their long-term strategy. But I don't know on the private sector side to be able to help you with that question.
Thanks, Sheila. Okay, we got some questions. Yeah, and by the way, identify yourself just briefly when you speak.
Hi, my name is Toshiya. I'm a CIPA student, second year here. And I have a question about implementation. I talked about how Japan is not ready about implementation, but aside from the problem of tax or how to fund it, we have a problem of how to balance the marine force, military ground force and air force, and then we have to think about the number of self-defense force people, because if we have more arms, we have to have more people, soldiers, to use that, right? But I don't come across any opinions that talk about a concrete way, those things. So I wonder who in the government is thinking of, my guess is that people at the top is thinking they're too senior to think about those strategic, small stuff, not small, but relatively logistic stuff. But the people at the bottom is thinking it's too grand to think about us, think for us or something like that. So I wonder what impression you have for those kind of things, and then how their Japanese ministry people are thinking.
So I'll give you a quick anecdote. I just got an email yesterday from a friend who is working in the Ministry of Defense, and he was in charge of U.S. Japan Defense Cooperation, and he's going into the Minister's Secretariat to talk about human resource development. So it is very much on the minds of the leadership of the MOD, how to recruit and develop and retain talent, and that's something we don't often think about in Japanese bureaucratic circles, but retaining talent is going to be really, really critical, obviously in cyber and in some of these other areas where there's private sector demand for the kinds of talent that the government is going to be looking for. So I suspect that there will be a lot of effort on that particular topic. On the recruitment for the uniform side, Japan has been always under capacity. It has accommodated that under recruitment by allowing people to be in the reserves for longer, so you retire at 55, as you know, extending retirement age, but also bringing older self-defense force leadership back to work in the reserves. I think the ministry was moving in the direction of actually project hire for people on specific aspects. I don't know where that is at the moment. Young Japanese people, though, as you know, the numbers are dwindling, right? So the working age population of Japan is getting smaller and smaller. So the competition for people like yourself is getting more and more fierce. And that's going to continue to be a problem for MOD. But I think it's a problem, obviously, that the government is going to have to address directly, both through incentives and obviously financial ones. But there is going to have to be an appeal so that the government doesn't look like the last place you want to go to work, or the self-defense force is the last place young people want to go to work. They're going to have to up their game to compete for you.
That's very good.
Or people like you, I should say.
Yeah, very true. Okay, lots of questions. Someone right up front here. You had a question. Yeah.
I'm Akira Endo, DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission of the Consulate General of Japan. And I have a short remark and very simple question. And first of all, allow me to congratulate on this new launch of this new program, so directed by you yourself, Professor General Curtis, and by the with head East Asian Institute in cooperation with the Columbia Business School Center on Japanese Economy and Business. And of course, I would like to thank you, Professor Sheila, Dr. Sheila, for your lecture. And of course, it's very valuable and informative and insightful. And of course, today's lecture is very, I think, timely. in light of the increasingly serious regional security environment in East Asia. And of course, Japan and the US have never been so strongly committed to enhancing coordination on all aspects, including economic relations. So it's important for us to continue our efforts so that the people figure out what's going on in the international affair since the change has been so drastic. And of course, our consulate is ready to support this new initiative as much as we can. We believe it will offer excellent opportunities for wider audience to better understand the ongoing situations in Japan, US, and East Asia. And my simple question, you mentioned, Professor Sheila, you mentioned about the military expenditure with a graphic. And even if Japan increased the budget, as is mentioned in the document, actually our military expenditure will be maybe, as far as I understand, half as the military expenditure by Chinese after 5 years, I mean. So in this, and also, as you know very well, we are very concerned about the reactions of the others. And so as I want to know your take on the reaction on the documents adopted in December, in particular China, and also the Asian countries in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, I have a slide that I often use when I used it when I was talking about my book in earlier presentations, because it surprises a lot of Americans, an American audience, but I think it also surprises a lot of Japanese. And that is, many of you are familiar with CPRI, the Stockholm Institute, right, for Peace Research. They have, amazing econometric specialists whose job is to compare defense spending among countries very professionally and very reliably. And so I use the CPRI data to point out that since the 1980s, since the late 1980s, Japan has been in the top 10 of global countries that invest in military power. And I think I use a language that is startling, I think, to some Japanese. But it's not because Japan hasn't had military power, right? It's that Japan has chosen to use it in certain ways. The purpose of that power has been different. I think you're right that even if you double, even if you're successful in the next 5 years of doubling your GDP growth, you will be far below the spending of China. It's not a half. It's likely to be more along the lines of 1/5 still. But Japan last year was somewhere around the 6-7 mark in terms of its annual expenditures on defense. Very similar to our NATO allies, France, right, UK. And in terms of percentage of GDP, that would be a different chart to compare with, obviously. But in terms of absolute spending, Japan, even with a successful implementation, it's going to be nowhere near the size of China. You might be a little closer to India, maybe a little closer to Saudi Arabia. And that's if nobody else changes. And that's a big assumption, right? Because that's not actually the reality that we should expect. But it's important to understand that people don't often think of the regional, right, balance separate from the United States. And I think it's always important to recognize the size of the militaries in the region that we think of today as the Indo-Pacific without us. I do think you asked a question about the responses. I was struck by the first response coming from Pyongyang, from Kim Jong-un himself, in fact, which is not what I expected. The Japanese are going militaristic again, and quite sharp words. But sharp words from Pyongyang are kind of the norm. But he's not normally he's not commenting on Japan. He's commenting on us. The Chinese response was, of course, Japan is returning to the path of militarism. It used all the language that it typically uses, but given the kind of language it could have used, it seemed to be sort of par for the course, expected, but not something that I was surprised by. Across the rest of the region, I have not seen any overt criticism, even from countries like Singapore or the Philippines, that might be a little sensitive to Japanese military power. Australia is one of your closest security allies, another country that's developed a very close relationship with you. So others here may have seen reaction, but I didn't see, but Pyongyang and Beijing The Russians, to my knowledge, framed their commentary largely in response to the way that they've reacted to Japan for its sanctioning of their invasion of Ukraine. And that is, Japan is an unfriendly state to Russia, right? They use that terminology to put you in the black box. And then they made some announcements about further deployments on the northern territories, and that they would never return to any conversation again, period. You know, so they framed it in terms of the way that they had responded to your response to their invasion, but not specific to the strategy document.
Just one additional word on that. In addition to the surprise or the reality that there's been very little, almost no opposition to the national security strategy and this change domestically, what's really impressive to me is that there's been almost no negative reaction in Asia, outside of China and North Korea. My sense the Chinese, it was not an intense reaction. It was very modulated. But the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, you go across the region and people are saying, it's kind of about time. This is a huge change. You don't hear talk about Japan's returning to its militaristic past.
Right.
5 years ago, you could not, even 5 years ago, I don't think you could have imagined that there would be this kind of almost blasé reaction to what the Japanese do. It just tells you how much all countries' perceptions of what needs to be done to deal with the disintegrating international order.
Right.
And it isn't simply by saying, well, we're going to go back and rebuild it. No, we need something new. And so it's a you know, for those of you, the students who are interested in the Indo-Pacific and Japan and foreign policy, this is unfortunately, you know, you don't want to say it's really an exciting, wonderful time, because it's not a wonderful time, it's a horrible time.
Definitely not
but it
wonderful,
is
yeah.
exciting, and I think what I hope you take away from this conversation and what Sheila had to say is, you know, it really is important to know something, to know a lot about the countries that you're interested in. There's no mathematical formula that's going to tell you what you need to know about how to deal with Japan. And that's why here at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, we've tried, and we're going to do it now more intensely than we've done it in a long time, to try to help train a generation that actually knows about the countries.
Right.
So, got a few more minutes, so let's get a few more questions in.
Wow.
Look at that! Wow, it's
We've unleashed.
the young fellow over there.
Hello, thank you. First of all, thank you very much. I had a question about Japan and their modern relations with Middle East. It's very important because, as we all know, Middle East is a very important region now, and while Iran is getting more and more powerful, and planning to change balance of powers in the region, with step-by-step developing nuclear weapons. I think Iran may jeopardize the region and whole balance that was built in there. So, is Japan building any strategies for future with Iran? Is Japan minding now?
Thank you. That's a very important question. Did you want to get other questions? Just one at a time.
All right, that's a good idea. Get a few more questions out there. Sure, go ahead. Yeah, I say you were the hand raised. Everybody has a hand raised, so yeah. And then
If you could stand up so I can see you
and then next to
tell
you,
me who you are.
Hi, Roskell D. I'm a Fulbright scholar at the Salzman's Institute.
Yes.
And my question sort of builds on one previous question about China. And so Japan isn't just reacting to the security environment, it's increasingly going to be reshaping it. And the question of implementation came up. And I was wondering whether you thought there was any specific or particular flashpoints that might occur during implementation that we should be looking out for vis-a-vis reaction of other states. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great question.
Okay. Yeah, right next to him.
Oh.
Susie?
Susie, back up.
Hi, my name is Mizuho. I'm a reporter of Asahi newspaper company, and I'm currently doing the visiting scholar here, and my boss is there, so I'm kind of nervous. But I just want to ask about the Article 9. So do you there's always a huge discussion or conversation about whether we keep the Article 9 or not, and do you think because my newspaper company is kind of a left running, so we kind of the stance that we want to keep the Article 9, but do you think we can keep Article 9, or do you think is it an obstacle to the expansion Japanese force? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one more question and then I'll...
Oh, I can't remember. Let me go get a pen.
All right, you want to talk to these?
Let me talk to these three. That way I don't have to get a pen.
Yeah, go ahead.
I
Talk
think
to these and then
so
I'll
very
get maybe...
quickly.
Then we'll get one or two others
Okay.
and we'll close.
So on the Iran question, Japan has since the 1970s and the oil shocks, had a very deliberate and expansive set of relationships with the Arab countries, right? And has, a fairly comprehensive relationship that include with Tehran. When Tehran is sanctioned, and of course Japan has to abide by UN Security Council decision making and will abide by that. But Japan is also, if you go way back, not way back, but if you go back to the 1990s and the Gulf War, if you go back to the 80s and the Iran-Iraq War, there are moments when Japan quietly opened the door for dialogue between the United States and Tehran when the United States couldn't directly have a conversation. So I think that relationship that Japan has maintained with Tehran over the years has not just been good for Japan, has also been good for ensuring that diplomacy can continue, even if it's quiet diplomacy. I wouldn't say, I am not a Middle East expert, so I don't have the eyesight that you have when you look at the future of the region. But Japan, over 90-some% of Japan's oil comes from the Middle East. So Japan has an enduring and continued interest in maintaining sea lanes of communication and trade, and will always look for coalition opportunities to make sure that that is maintained. I don't know how to predict Iranian behavior, but I suspect that the Japan-Iranian relationship will continue to be a constructive one, even if the United States has trouble in that relationship. Not sure that gets your question. I just want to point out, everybody, this gentleman we met in the elevator, he is in the 9th grade and has come out to learn about Japan and the Indo-Pacific, which I think is an incredible statement.
Even more interesting,
Yes.
he came 6 months ago from the Ukraine.
That I didn't know. So let's just say we need to up our game here, our young people. All right, question from the gentleman about what to look at implementation and reaction from other nations. I think there's two pieces. Obviously, the defense budget is going to be the hard one politically at home. I don't expect Japan's neighboring countries will have much to say about that, but they will be gleeful if Japan can't do what it said it's going to do. So that's a quiet ha-ha-ha kind of moment for those who would not like to see Japan double its spending. I think the more critical one, and you know probably better than anyone, is the counterstrike. When that gets deployed, how it gets deployed, do expect that Japan's neighbors will have something to say about it. I expect, Tom has gone, but Tom is another person to talk to about this. I expect that the PLA and the Russian-China militaries together are going to give the maritime self-defense forces a bit of a run for their money. And I think that will be a signal of their understanding of what the Tomahawk does. The Tomahawk, by the way, allows Japan to reach onto continental Asia in a way it has not been able to do in the past. So 600 to 800 miles. If you have a ship in the East China Sea, that takes you very deep into Chinese strategic, it takes you into Chinese territory, that range. Certainly takes you up to North Korea. Right now, the South Korea-Japan relationship looks like it's on a good trajectory, I hope. But But that's another place where on the Korean Peninsula wouldn't just be the North, but the South will also want to keep an eye on exactly how the U.S. and Japan are thinking about the deployment of that capability. So that's where, short answer to your question, that's where I would keep your eye out. On the, I think the language you want to use is center-left newspaper. To give you a diplomatic way of introducing Asahi. There's only one thing I wanted to say about your comment about the question and how you posed the question is, even on the right, I don't hear many voices that say get rid of Article 9. And so Sankei or Yomiuri, again, right and center right, however we want to position those two media, which would be different from Asahi, right? They are not advocates of getting rid of Article 9. So I think that's important, first of all, to make sure that everybody understands where I think the Article 9 debate is inside the Liberal Democratic Party. There are some, and some of these are kind of hawks or defense nerds, depending on the language that you like the most. Former ministers of defense, Sishiba, for example, think that the elasticity of interpretation is a problem for Japan, and it should be clear about what it actually means. So you get a pretty sophisticated debate across the spectrum inside the Conservative Party, and I think that translates out into the way that the media also cover some of those topics. So it's not get rid of Article 9. It's changed the language of the second paragraph. And for those of you, it's in my book, but there are others, if you're nerdy about this, go read Article 9 again, and you will see that second paragraph has words like war potential and things like that. It's that second paragraph that the conservatives, center or otherwise, have their eyes on. And I think that's the piece that's going to continue to be of interest to the more hawkish side of Japanese public as well.
I got to add just a word about Article 9, which is that a lot of my interactions with people who are hawks in the LDP is, yeah, we want to change Article 9, but not now. The important thing is to make sure that the public supports what we're doing on the military side, and raising Article 9 will bring other issues into the equation. No, let's avoid it. Right. So I think the bottom line here is that Article 9 at some point, yeah, it may be revised. I think a lot of younger politicians, interestingly, think it should be changed, but it's not. It's not on the agenda anytime soon. So.
Can I add one thing? And I think it's really important for this. Japan has transformed its military capability, including through the ambitions outlined in December. The Constitution has never been revised, right? So I think Article 9 is not necessarily directly implicating policy change in the military sphere, but it is the public's understanding of the intent of Article 9 and why it needs to stay in the Constitution or come out, right? That's the political debate that's worth watching, in my view.
Uh-huh. The witching hour.
This poor gentleman in the back has been trying hard.
Who has? I'll get one more question.
Thanks. A quick question,
Sorry,
just one. I remember there's just a tidbit on the Asahi Shimbun. There's like a poll that said that the Taiwanese sort of trust the JSDF more than the U.S. to intervene in conflict. And I was just wondering if you could maybe speak on that and the possibility of that. And also, do you see Japan ever having mandatory conscription or military service? I know that might be more difficult with the essence of the Japanese Constitution, allowing for more liberties than that of Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore. But I was just wondering if you could provide some context on that, given the demographic shifts.
So I don't know if the Asahi was reporting on a poll that was done in Taiwan, and it was a spot-off poll, so one moment. And it was last year, I believe it was last year or late 2021. But the question that was asked in Taiwan was, who do you think is more reliable, Japan or the United States? And it didn't say reliable for what, but it wasn't that specific, and Japan topped the United States. But that's sort of a one-off poll. I am suspect that actually reflects Taiwanese public opinion. But I think we should remember that the Taiwanese people have an affinity for Japan that is different. It's a former colony, right? But it is different than other colonial experiences. And so the public opinion there's not as deep antipathy towards Japan there as there may be in other parts of the post-colonial world. But I do think, and this goes back to the question by the Fulbright scholar who's maybe gone, the Taiwan conversation in the alliance is going to occasion all kinds of politics in Japan. Pro, con, do more, do less, let the Americans use the bases. Oh, for God's sake, don't let them use the bases. So we have a lot of homework, and it's on the minds of policymakers, obviously, in both countries. But we have a lot of homework in the alliance to do, and that's also another place to watch the politics in Japan, because I think you'll get a better sense of Japanese public opinion. Taiwanese public opinion is going to be tested in January of 2024. For those of you who follow Taiwan, the election is coming up. And believe me, if another speaker goes to visit and there's a Chinese response, all of these are interactive. These political responses and perceptions, and none of this is in isolation of each other. So I think the Taiwanese conversation about their future is going to be a very interesting one to watch as well.
Well, it's kind of interesting that we're ending this conversation with some talk about Taiwan, because most of the conversations about Japanese defense issues these days is Japan going to participate if there's a Taiwan contingency zone? Somehow we got through today
until the very end
with a very, I thought, just a wonderful presentation and a great conversation with all of you about Japanese defense policy. And we never got to Taiwan, so you have to come back so we can have our Taiwan conversation next time. So thank you all for coming today. Let's thank Sheila.